Montana Territory, August 1883. The wind whipped low across the dry plains just outside of Miles City when Elias McCall rode into town with dust in his boots and a tired look in his eyes. He was not searching for trouble, but he knew by the end of the day, he would find something that would change the shape of his life. The noise of the town pressed in, horses snorting, wagons creaking, children yelling, but his eyes caught on one figure near the general store steps. A woman, standing stiff with her back straight and her chin high, even as two boys no older than 15 laughed behind her. "Look at her drag that leg," one jeered. "Should have stayed in the shadows, cripple," the other added. Elias dismounted before he realized he meant to. The woman didn't flinch or turn toward them. She just gathered her small bag closer to her side and limped forward, slow and proud. "Hey," Elias said sharply, approaching the boys. "You think that's funny? Try saying it again." The boys backed up, eyes wide. One muttered something, and both scattered. The woman paused, but didn't look at him. Her shoulders were carved from stone. "You all right, ma'am?" Elias asked. Her voice was calm. "I do not need saving, thank you." He smiled. Not offering saving. Just felt like knocking two loudmouths into the dirt. That made her glance at him, only for a second. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and not softened by anything. "You did not knock them down," she said. "I was being polite," he replied. She blinked once, then nodded and turned back to her steps. Her limp was pronounced, her right leg dragging slightly before she stepped forward again, but she moved with purpose. Elias watched her go, her long skirts brushing dust, and felt something settle in his chest. Later that day, he saw her again, this time at the edge of the churchyard, speaking in quiet tones to the preacher. Her name, he learned, was Olive Varnell. She had arrived by stagecoach 3 weeks ago and had been staying with an older widow out by the creek. No one knew much about her, only that she had no husband, no family, and no patience for pity. That night, Elias could not sleep. 2 days later, he found her again, not by accident. She was at the back of the livery stable, trying to lift a sack of oats. "You should let someone else handle that," Elias said. "I am capable," Olive replied, her jaw tight. "I believe you," he said. "Still, let me help." She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she stepped back. "I suppose if you insist." He hoisted the sack and set it down near the stall. "You from somewhere around here?" he asked. "No," she said simply. "I came from Kansas. My father passed. I had to leave." He waited for more, but she offered nothing. "I've got a place," Elias said suddenly. "Out west of here. About 5 miles. If you're looking to stay somewhere safer." Olive turned to him then, chin still high. "Why would you offer that?" Elias shrugged. "Because I know what it feels like to be stared at." She studied him. "You do not limp." "No," he said. "But I got a brother buried out by my barn." Folks looked at him like he didn't belong. "I remember how that felt." Olive was quiet a long time. "I do not take charity." "It is not charity," Elias said. "It is a place to breathe. That's all." She didn't answer right then. But 3 days later, she showed up at his gate with her bag and a single book tucked under one arm. Elias stood on the porch as she approached, her limp steady, the sun low behind her, turning her hair to copper. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I do not go where I am not wanted." "Well then," he said, walking down to meet her. "You are wanted." She looked up at him, something uncertain flickering in her eyes. He bent low, without asking, and slid one arm behind her knees, the other around her shoulders. She gasped, startled. "What are you, carrying you across the threshold?" Elias said, grinning. "Seems right. You are not, this is not," but she didn't resist. Her arms came around his neck, light and unsure, and her breath hitched in his ear. The door creaked open behind them. He stepped through, her weight warm in his arms. She looked up at him then, something soft breaking through her defenses. "You are a strange man, Elias McCall." "And you," he said, setting her down slowly in the middle of his modest front room, "are the strongest woman I have ever met." She didn't speak, but her fingers brushed his wrist before she stepped away. That night, she sat by his fire, book open but unread. Elias brought her tea, and she accepted it without a word. The house was quiet, but something deeper had begun. Not just survival side by side, but something more. Something waiting. Morning settled over the prairie slow and gold. Elias had already been outside since first light, hauling water from the well, and cutting kindling from the cottonwood round stacked beneath the lean-to. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt her presence behind him, quiet as a doe, watching. "I could have helped," Olive said. Her voice was steady, but softer than it had been days before. "You could have," Elias answered. "But you didn't need to." She stepped onto the porch, her cane tapping once against the wood. "I don't like being idle." "I don't aim to keep you idle, Olive. Only figured you might want the morning to yourself." She glanced toward the hills, where the light was catching in long waves over the grass. "I've had too many mornings to myself. I'd rather be of use." He nodded once, set the hatchet down. "There's fruit needs rinsing, and flour that could be sifted. If you're set on it." "I am." She turned, and he followed her inside. The kitchen was plain but clean, the table handmade and worn smooth at the edges. She moved with slow care, but not hesitation, as she filled the basin and worked with her sleeves rolled back. Elias watched her fingers narrow, sure, with a small scar across the middle knuckle of her left hand. "You ever work in a kitchen before?" Elias asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I taught at a mission school," Olive replied. "Outside Junction City. We did what needed doing. I didn't mind the work." "The Limp?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. "A wagon overturned in high water. I was the only one pulled out breathing. My leg never healed right." He waited. She said nothing more, and he didn't push. Instead, he moved to fetch the coffee, pouring 2 tin cups and setting one beside her. "You get many visitors out here?" she asked. "Not unless I want them." "And do you?" He took a sip, then smiled behind the rim. "Not often." A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the sound of her hands in the water and the wind brushing against the eaves. "You had a brother," she said at last. "What happened?" "Pneumonia. 2 winters back. He was younger than me, but always had trouble with his lungs. We buried him near the cottonwoods." Olive dried her hands with the corner of her skirt. "That's a hard thing." "It was," Elias said. "Still is." She met his gaze then, and something passed between them, not sympathy, but recognition. By mid-afternoon, they were in the field behind the barn, pulling weeds from the kitchen plot. Elias knelt beside a row of wilting beets, while Olive sat on a low stool he'd brought from the root cellar. Her fingers worked carefully through the soil, brushing around the stems without disturbing the roots. "I never had land," she said. "My father leased. Year by year, never enough to call home." "This is home," Elias said, "if you want it to be." She looked at him, dirt smudged on her cheek. "You speak plain. I don't see the sense in circling truths." They worked in silence again, until the sun started to dip and the wind cooled. That evening, Elias lit the lantern and set it on the mantel while Olive sat by the stove, mending a tear in her shawl. Her stitches were tidy, her expression focused. "I could build a ramp," Elias offered, "for the porch, if it'd make things easier." "I don't need easier," she said, not unkindly. "I know," he said, "but you might like it just the same." She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him no, either. Later, as he stood on the back step smoking, she came up beside him. "I'm not used to this," she said. "Which part?" "Being looked at like I belong." He turned toward her. "That's because most folks ain't worth knowing." She smiled, just barely, and looked out toward the field. "Do you think I'm foolish for coming here?" she asked. "No," he said. "I think you're brave." She was quiet a long time, then said, "I don't feel brave." "You don't have to feel it for it to be true." She looked at him then, the porch light catching in her hair. "I should get some rest." "I'll be here," he said. As she stepped inside, her hand brushed his. Not by accident. He stayed on the porch until the last of the sky turned dark and cool. He didn't know where this would lead, not exactly. But he knew she was no longer a stranger. And he knew she had come to stay. The first real storm rolled in 4 days later, a hard summer rain that flattened the ryegrass and pushed against the windows with low thunder. The air smelled of wet soil and sagebrush, and Olive stood barefoot at the edge of the porch, watching the trees bend and sway. "You always stand out in weather like this?" Elias asked, stepping beside her with a towel draped around his neck. "I like the sound of it," she said. "It reminds me I'm still here." He didn't speak, just leaned against the post and listened with her. The rain fell steady and without pause, a long hush over the land. When the wind shifted, she turned slightly, bracing her weight on the cane. "I'll need to earn my place here," she said after a while. "You already have. You're kind, But that's not what I mean. I can read and write. If there are children nearby who need teaching, or if you need letters written, I can do that. There's a family 2 miles south, their eldest boy's near 12, but he's never held a book. Think his mother would be grateful for a teacher. I'll speak with her. Elias watched her hands. They were clenched lightly around the cane, knuckles pale. You don't have to prove anything to me. I'm not trying to, she said. Only to myself. He nodded once, letting that settle. By the following afternoon, the rain had passed, and the sun returned with a crisp edge. Olive laid laundry out on the line behind the barn, while Elias patched the fence along the south pasture. They moved through their work without need for words, a rhythm beginning to form between them. Not rehearsed, but real. At supper, she brought out a jar of preserved plums from her trunk. My mother taught me to can, she said, setting it on the table. We didn't have much, but we made things last. Elias lifted the lid and dipped a spoon into the syrup. She teach you how to cook too? She taught me how to stretch a meal for 6 out of what was meant for 3. That's a kind of magic. She smiled faintly. She would have liked you. Thought you were too quiet, but liked you all the same. You talk about her like she's close. She is, in the ways that matter. After they ate, Olive stayed at the table, mending a loose thread in the curtain hem. Elias busied himself with the firewood, stacking it tighter by the hearth. The light between them was soft, the kind that draws long shadows and quiet thoughts. Do you miss the town? He asked after a time. No. I miss the sound of bells in the morning, maybe, but not the rest. Then you don't regret coming here? She didn't answer right away. Then, setting her stitching aside, she looked at him. This house is the first place I've ever felt I could stay. Elias met her eyes. Then stay. The wind stirred outside, gentle now, carrying the scent of pine and distant grass smoke. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, resting her hand against the sill. I'm not used to being looked at the way you do. How's that? Like I'm whole. I don't pretend you haven't been hurt, he said. But I see you. Every part of you. She didn't speak, but after a moment, she crossed the room and stood near him. Her hand brushed his arm, light as a leaf. I'm not afraid of the work, she said. Whatever kind it is. I never thought you were. Then I'll stay, she said, voice low. And I'll build something here, if you'll let me. He reached for her hand, calloused and strong, and held it between his own. You already have. The wheatgrass around the cabin had turned honey-colored by mid-September, tall enough to whisper when the wind turned restless. Elias had started cutting the last of the hay in the northern field, and Olive had begun keeping ledgers for a cattleman's widow who lived across the ridge. She walked there 3 times a week, early enough to catch the cool of morning, returning by dusk with ink on her fingertips and her skirts dusted pale. One evening, Olive stood at the basin scrubbing dirt from her hands, her sleeves damp to the elbow. I passed a man near the ridge trail today, she said, drying her hands on the cloth by the stove. He asked if I was the cripple staying with Elias McCall. Elias paused, his hand stilling on the iron poker. What did you say? I told him I was Olive McCall, and if he wanted to finish his sentence, he'd best be ready to hear mine. Elias leaned the poker back against the hearth. You took my name. I needed something to tell him that wasn't the truth he expected. He crossed the room slowly. Did you mean it? I did. A silence hung there, not heavy, but waiting. There's a ring in my father's chest, Elias said. Silver band. Was meant for someone once, but she left before it was given. I kept it because it still had meaning. Thought maybe one day it might suit someone else. Olive's gaze settled on him, unflinching. I've no use for promises unless they're meant plain. I'm not offering easy things, Olive. I'm offering a life. She took a step closer, her hand resting lightly at her side. Then I'll need 2 things. Name them. First, that we speak truth, always. No hiding behind kindness. You have it. Second, she said, voice low, that you never carry me unless I ask. Elias's mouth lifted at the corner. That one'll be harder. She reached forward and tugged his shirt front gently. Then you'll learn. He rested his forehead against hers, the lantern light catching the curve of her cheek. I never thought I'd have this. Not after the years I've seen. You have it now, she whispered. That night, they lay with the window open, the air cool and still. Olive rested with her head against his chest, her cane leaning beside the bedpost. No words passed between them, only the sound of breath and the soft creak of old timber settling. Morning came with the hush of birdsong and the smell of wood smoke. Elias rose early to fetch water while Olive prepared bread dough on the table. When he returned, he paused in the doorway, watching her work kneading with care, her weight braced evenly, the sunlight warm across her shoulders. "You planning to bake a wedding loaf?" he asked. She didn't look up. "I'm planning to feed the men from the South Fence crew. They're coming at noon to fix your gate." "Well," he said, setting down the bucket, "you'll feed them better than they deserve. I plan to feed you better than you expect, too." He stepped behind her, slid his arms around her waist, and rested his cheek against her temple. "I expect nothing," he said. "But I'll take everything you give." She turned her face and kissed his jaw, soft and certain. Later, after the crew had gone and the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods, Elias led her out to the small grove near the fence line. A thin cotton cloth covered a stone by the creek, and on it sat the silver ring, polished and quiet. "I don't have a preacher," he said, "but I have this land and my word." Olive reached for the ring, turning it once in her fingers. "Then give it to me, and I'll give you mine." He slid it onto her finger, his hand steady. She kissed his palm. They stood there as the sky deepened to amber, the wind lifting her hair and carrying it around his collar. No vows were spoken aloud. They didn't need to be. The promise had already been made, long before the ring. In the way they worked beside one another, in the quiet strength between them, in the weight of what they'd both survived and chosen to build from it. They walked back to the house, together, and when the door closed behind them, the world outside went still. The first frost came early that year. By the time the pumpkin vines curled brown and brittle against the earth, the mornings had begun to bite. Elias took to lighting the stove before dawn, coaxing warmth into the cabin before Olive's feet touched the floor. She never asked him to. He did it because he wanted to. She'd taken over the east wall with her papers now neatly stacked ledgers, a slate board, and a hand-drawn map of nearby homesteads where children lived. She was teaching 5 of them now, spread across 3 families. Some came to the cabin in the afternoons, others she visited on foot, her cane tapping steadily along the trails she'd memorized. One evening, after she'd finished marking a boy's writing with quiet satisfaction, Elias watched her tuck the folded paper into her satchel. "I saw you talking to Charles Pratt earlier," he said, drying his hands from the wash basin. He looked like a man with too much to say. "He asked if I'd consider starting a proper schoolhouse," she said. "Said some of the ranchers might be willing to donate lumber and help raise it come spring. You thinking on it?" "I am." I told him I'd only agree if you were part of it. He raised an eyebrow. "Me? What did I do to deserve that?" "You know how to build," she said, lowering herself into the worn rocking chair by the fire. "And you're the only man I've known who listens first and speaks second." Elias leaned against the hearth, arms crossed. "You'd have to give up some of your time here. I'd come home each night." He looked at her, the firelight softening the angle of her cheek, the steady way her hands rested over her knees. "I'd help you raise it," he said. "Every board." She nodded once. "Then I'll say yes." The next week, she began gathering names: families with children, ranchers with surplus timber, widows with time and willingness to sew curtains or bring food. Elias hitched the wagon and drove her from homestead to homestead, never rushing her, letting her speak her own way, in her own time. Some folks hesitated, unsure of a woman leading anything. But Olive didn't press. She simply stated her intent and let the weight of it settle. One evening, as they drove back across the low ridge, Olive tucked her hair beneath her shawl and looked out across the open land. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked. "Used to," Elias said, flicking the reins gently. "Now I don't." "Why not?" "'Cause everything I want's already here." She didn't speak for a long while, just leaned into his shoulder as he guided the mare through the fading light. They were married proper before the first snow, not in a church, but beneath the cottonwoods, where his younger brother rested. Olive wore a dress she'd sewn herself, pale blue with a line of embroidery along the cuffs. Elias shaved and combed his hair and wore the same coat he'd worn to his father's funeral, mended at the collar. A dozen neighbors came, bringing fresh baked bread and jars of peach preserves and a cedar cradle one of the women had carved herself. After the vows were spoken and the hands joined, Elias kissed her slow, firm, nothing hidden. She held his face when it ended, fingers resting along his jaw like she'd always known where they belonged. Winter came in quiet layers. They spent it reading books from the box Olive had brought west, learning how to make soap from tallow, and planning the schoolhouse with measured lines and folded paper. The cabin held warmth now not just from the stove, but from the life inside it. When the thaw came, they began hauling timber from the mill. The neighbors arrived 2 weeks later, men with saws and hammers, women with kettles and blankets for the children. The schoolhouse rose in 3 days, a single room with a wide window facing the hills. Olive stood in the doorway after the last shingle was nailed down, her eyes fixed ahead like she could already see a line of children filing through with slates and questions in their hands. That night, Elias brought her a cup of coffee and stood beside her by the window. "You built something," he said. "We did." He reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers with his without looking away. The next morning, she opened the schoolhouse with 6 children seated in a row of mismatched chairs. Elias watched from the ridge, arms crossed, pride quiet in his chest. By summer, they'd planted a garden twice the size of the one before. Olive taught 5 days a week and spent her evenings in the field, sleeves rolled, hands deep in soil. Elias started carving furniture in the barn chairs, small tables, a cradle that sat waiting in the corner of their bedroom. In late August, with the wheat ready for cutting and the heat sitting low across the land, Olive handed Elias a folded square of muslin with a small embroidered mark in the corner. He opened it. Inside was a single line of stitching, a date, 8 months hence. He looked up, eyes wide. She smiled. "I think it's time we make room." He took her hands and pulled her close. "You're sure?" "I've never been surer of anything." He held her then, long and still, the kind of embrace that doesn't need words. Seasons turned again. The cabin grew fuller, the fields more golden. The schoolhouse, painted white that spring, stood firm, laughter echoing from its windows. Olive taught until her belly grew too heavy to sit long, and Elias took over her walks, delivering lessons and letters with care. Their son, named Samuel, after Elias's brother, was born just after the first thaw. He had Olive's quiet eyes and Elias's patient hands. They laid him in the cradle Elias had built, Olive humming soft tunes passed down from her mother. Years spun onward, slow and generous. They stayed. They worked. They raised their boy with hands steady and hearts open. The land grew around them, not tamed, but respected. And on every clear morning, Elias lit the stove before Olive's feet touched the floor. He never stopped.